Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Rational Standard. We have a full lineup today of very esteemed participants. I'm Martin van Staden, joined as usual by David Ansara and Zakhele Mthembu, and Ayanda Zulu hasn't joined us for a few weeks. It's great to have him back. Thanks, gents, for being here. Um, yeah, so this week, of course, has been a busy week in politics. A few things happened, but I think the most notable thing that, kind of for our purposes, we've always kind of focused since Rational Standard relaunched as a podcast. We focused on um, uh, kind of the foreign policy posture of South Africa. It's not like we're a bunch of foreign policy experts necessarily, but it's having very severe domestic consequences. And last week we discussed a particular manifestation of this as the chief of the South African National Defence Force, Rdzani Mapanya, going to Iran. Let me share my screen here. This was our discussion last week. We encourage everyone to have a look at it. This was when the national dialogue, so-called national dialogue, was kicking off, and suddenly no one knew that the head of our military was in Tehran, kind of changing South Africa's formal posture towards the conflict there. And the president spokesperson said that the commander in chief of the military wasn't aware. Durko distanced themselves from his comments. The Department of Defense even distanced themselves from the general's comments initially. But since then, and this story is from an hour ago in the Cape Times, SANDF chief cleared of wrongdoing after controversial trip to Iran. Now, kind of before in a previous meeting, I was saying to some of my colleagues, there's this enduring mentality, it seems, in the South African political structures. It's almost like a cargo cult approach to due process, a very kind of formalistic approach, whereby this idea of, well, let's do a due process, and then we kind of have a fiat accompli about what the outcome is, and then we'll say everything is okay. And this is another example of that, where everything now just needs to be okay. The Americans just have to be calm. Everyone just has to relax now because it's fine. He's been cleared of any wrongdoing. So yeah, this is all kind of boilerplate nonsense. What I did find funny, though, which I'll point out, is the EFF statement. They say they are appalled by our government's interference with the work of the military. This is conduct unbecoming of a constitutional state. And I just thought that would be interesting for our listeners, for how warped the EFF and their command structures and their high command and whatever see the world. It's appalling when the civil and democratic government interferes in the work of the military. It's unbecoming of a constitutional state. Guys, this is just to kind of bring it full circle about what we discussed last week. David, maybe we'll start with you. You have any lingering thoughts about about this story, and maybe any updated thoughts about how it's turned out? I think all of us said, well, at the least that the president could do is kind of fire this guy, and at most fire the minister of defense, and maybe himself resign. Apparently, none of that, not even the bare minimum, is going to happen.
Yeah, I quite liked the spokesperson in the presidency, Vincent Magwenya, who described the visit as ill-advised, quote unquote, which I thought was maybe the euphemism of the year. It certainly was ill-advised. But what I found quite interesting is, in terms of the spin, is Mapanya, the general, said that, oh no, he doesn't know where these quotes came from because he didn't speak to any journalists in Tehran, and that basically these Iranian officials mischievously included these quotes, these contentious quotes, in their press releases, and he had nothing to do with it. So yeah, I guess nothing to see here, guys. On with your normal business. But yeah, so I think it's been interesting to see the evolution of the spin on this, because at first Durko was coming out quite critically and distancing itself from him, but now it looks like we're in damage control mode.
Yeah, Zakes, maybe any thoughts from you from last week and kind of how the story has developed?
Yeah, I mean, it has been pretty interesting. I read that Cape Times article, right? It is the general is about to retire, I think, and because they are trying to spin it as a big hullabaloo. So I'm just thinking, right, let us try and still man the position of these politicians. They are currently negotiating with the United States. So we know that they think this is bad, because Durka came out by rejecting the statement and everything. I think Durka still is distancing itself from the statement. It's just that they're trying to balance, I guess, two competing forces, because there are people who like the AFF, right? And I'm sure a large contingent of the ANC's own internal structures who don't disagree with what the general said, right? Then the president coming out and punishing the general may not be politically viable for him internally. I don't know, but I guess you can give it the benefit of the doubt that since he's about to retire, they'll be like, he'll be gone soon. So what's the need of firing him? I think though the principle, right? The whole PR of saying, hey, here's a consequence for going against something that is detrimental to our interests as a jurisdiction would have been great, but I doubt that we'll be getting that. And also from the article too, I saw that they were talking to, I think, the Deputy Secretary of State in the US, like a bunch of deputies from SA, the Deputy Minister of Constitutional Development, and I think Ministry and Defense. They were talking, they had a call earlier on, but the report didn't say that they specifically spoke about the Iranian visit, but I would assume that it is something that the Americans would be interested in, and nothing really has come out of what they actually spoke about in that meeting or in that phone call. So it should be interesting to see, right? Because I most definitely the Americans won't be happy, right, about the comments. But I guess maybe the government thinks that they've done enough, like with Durko distancing itself and saying, "Hey, this is not the official South African position." We'll see. We will have to see. We will have to see. But and then there's the thing that in a couple of months, maybe I don't know when the general is retiring, he'll be gone, and so they'll be like, "Hey, that guy is gone, so whatever he said doesn't hold any weight." But yeah, in general, of course, from last week, I like what needed to happen. Bare minimum was for the general to either be fired or suspended, right? If he's gonna be retiring, it was gonna be even easier, just like give him earlier retirement since he's already planning it. But yeah, it doesn't seem like the president is necessarily interested in that, or the Ministry of Defense. Like, yeah, our president is, yeah, taking decisions is something he seems patently allergic to. So yeah.
It is a principled opposition to consequences for anything.
Pretty
Ayanda,
much.
you didn't join us last week, so maybe any thoughts you have about this whole hullabaloo and how it's turned out?
Yeah. Thanks, Martin. Thank you very much for that introduction. um, I don't think I want to get into the technicalities of whether General was right or wrong. What I do want to say is that this is deeply unfortunate. I do think that we find ourselves as a country in an unprecedented moment where our relations with the USA have reached an all-time low, and in such a context, such a visit only worsens the situation. From where I'm standing, I think this doesn't look good for us as a country. Again, here we are, seemingly aligning ourselves again with a country that sponsors terrorism and which is, of course, an enemy of the USA. So, what you would ideally have wanted, as Zex has already noted, is for the general to either be suspended or to be fired. But as Zex has said, we have a president who is spineless, in my view. He lacks decisiveness. He can't take decisive action because he's the kind of leader who really wants to please everyone. And I think that's his biggest problem. But in such a situation where a general has taken such a decision to go and meet another foreign country in that manner, you would want to act against him to send a clear message. So, not acting against him and trying to do this balancing act doesn't really help us. I think it worsens our relations with the USA. It doesn't improve them. And going down the line, It actually shows the USA that we aren't taking this entire thing seriously. And just one more point that I wanted to add in response to what the EFF said, and this is something again interesting, which I saw the other day on Facebook, which was posted by Umpiake Dlamini. There's this chat about sovereignty that we always have, that South Africa is a sovereign state and it shouldn't be bullied, and the USA shouldn't meddle in its affairs. And if you accept that view, then you also have to accept the view that America is also a sovereign state that has the right to do whatever it wants to do, geopolitically, and when it comes to matters of foreign policy. So I think once we understand that this confusion which we have of people saying the USA is interfering or doing whatever is going to end, the USA isn't interfering. It is doing exactly what any other country would do, which is to advance its own interests. There's nothing wrong with that. And if we want to align ourselves with Iran or whoever else, we have the right to do that, but there are consequences for that, and we need to understand that. I think those really, in a nutshell, are my thoughts around this issue, my initial thoughts.
Yeah, well stated. I agree. I saw that post by Mpiaki Dlamini, old researcher of the FMF. For those of you who don't know, he has some good takes on foreign policy. But
He's
yeah,
not
just
that old, Martin. Come on.
well, yeah, he's older than I am, so that's enough. So
He's not as old as me, so now you're really aging me.
oh, jeez. At least we're not a bunch of women who don't want to give away our age. So yeah. So I mean, on this topic, the Free Market Foundation did something this week. We published our second Liberty First paper in our Amplified project, where we drill a little bit deeper into the original proposals that we made for viewers who don't recall. Right after last year's election and the formation of the so-called Government of National Unity, we launched the Liberty First project to effectively show this new government, for what that's worth, that there are in fact ways to spur growth, economic freedom, strengthen the rule of law, strengthen the value of the currency to encourage saving, etc. And we kind of showed that in each of these areas, premised on the Economic Freedom of the World Global Report, that there are avenues to reform. Some of them a little bit more kind of deep, and others quite low-hanging fruit, something the government can do immediately. And now in this year's project, kind of as an extension of that, we're looking at specific interventions, specific reforms that we proposed back then that could be implemented by the government. The first paper in this year's series was on expropriation without compensation. I launched that. I wrote that paper a few weeks ago, and then we did a podcast about that as well. So I encourage everyone to check that out. This week we did free trade and tariffs, and the author of the paper this week was Dr. Morne Malan, who used to be a regular contributor on this show. We hope to have him back again soon. He couldn't make it today, unfortunately, but he had his paper launched, Troubled Waters, Rescuing South Africa from a Tariff Disaster. And this is available on the website of the Free Market Foundation. And I'm going to hand over to Zakes soon. I just want to scroll down to the recommendations. There we go. At the very end of the paper, effectively what Dr. Malan recommended was unilateral liberalization of trade from South Africa's perspective. Our media is filled with, oh God, the Americans this, and Trump is going to kill all these poor people, and my God. Whatever you think about that, we can't do anything about what Trump is going to do other than to reform on our side, to make it easier for South Africa to trade, or to do what the Americans have very reasonably asked us to do. We'll see if that ever happens. But we are not the U.S. State Department. We are not the U.S. government. We cannot repeal the American tariffs. So we need to ask, what can South Africa do? And this is very helpfully what Dr. Malan set out. So I'm going to hand over to Zakes now to just give us an overview of the paper and the launch event that occurred this week, where Zakes was in conversation with Dr. Malan. Zakes, over to you.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you, Martin. I mean, it was cool. It was cool. I love hosting and everything. I love talking, really. So, the hosting of the presentation was pretty cool. And we were talking about tariffs, right? Something pretty topical. Unfortunate that in South Africa we don't get as much engagement as when we're talking about property, because compared to your presentation, Martin, we had, I think, only 2 or 3 people engaging, whereas with you even had trolls and everything. So yeah, it was pretty great. But as the paper overall, right, there's something that pretty much stuck with me that Monet said, and he was like, as part of his recommendations, right, that just because someone is throwing stones, I think, at their heart doesn't mean that you should do the same. And I think that's the main point of the paper, because it firstly there's the categorization and the framing of the arguments for protectionism and general increasing of tariffs, and that I think is pretty novel. I hadn't seen it before. I saw it on Monet's paper, which shows the contradictory nature of these 3 varying justifications for protectionism, which is the generation of revenue, the protection of local industries, and kind of forgetting the third one. Let me see.
Geopolitical
Oh, and
interests.
geopolitical interests. The most topical one, at least for us here on the pod, right? But yeah, the geopolitical interest, generating revenue, and protecting local industries. And he showed how, these 3 justifications, pursuing one means by nature negating the pursuit of the other. But using Donald Trump as an example, of course, he always uses them in conjunction and in unison, saying that I'm instituting tariffs because I want to generate revenue for the US. I want to project strength and not have the US be taken advantage of somehow. And I also want to bring back American jobs, as you would say. So, him showing how contradictory that is, how if you increase revenues by nature, if you want to increase revenue from imports, you want to have more imports, which would mean that you are undermining the protection of local industries. If you want to protect local industries, you have to have higher imports, meaning you will undermine the revenue generation. And that to me was pretty great in showing how, of course, we know that tariffs are unsound, but when you really get into something, you start seeing these logical contradictions within it, and then you start seeing how really stupid that they are. And then the geopolitical aspect of it was pretty nice to see it, because we all know that economic decisions are taken without any economic consequences in mind, but seeing it laid out like geopolitical aims are not connected in any way to the to any economic aim that may be used. Like the aim of geopolitics using tariffs is not connected to the consequences, right? Someone uses an economic tool not for economic purposes but rather for political purposes, and that of course tends to create a whole lot of problems. So to me, that framing was very important, because it kind of cuts the feet from the argument by saying, yeah, before we even begin, you all are not going to get what you want, before we even get to the point of saying, hey, this is not the greatest of ideas, it will increase prices for people and everything like that. But yeah, it was amazing to see. And then we like the recommendations themselves, right? To me, as I said, the most telling part to me, the most easiest of recommendation really to implement was just don't retaliate. I think that is something that you need to internalize, not only in South Africa, but I would think that all across the world, right? Particularly if you have an economy that isn't as strong as the United States, and I think that would be the rest of the world, maybe with the exception of China, and even then, the US economy is still bigger. But we can't get into a trade war as China would by increasing tariffs and everything like that, because our economy just isn't big enough. And beyond the economy being big enough, it is not the smartest thing to do, right? Tariffs are things that South Africans or the consumers in whatever jurisdiction institutes them are the ones who pay the tariffs. And as such, why would you want to make things more expensive for people? The US does not have this dire economic situation as South Africa. So for us, it is even much more worse. We have high unemployment, low growth, and a large like millions of people who live on the lowest of incomes, right, relative to other South Africans. And like these are a growing majority with every passing year, given the state of our economy. So making things much more expensive for them is not a good idea. And even politically, it just is not a good idea. So I think that is one of the most telling recommendations to me, like, just don't retaliate. And it also sticks in line with my entire views of laissez-faire, like, the classical view of saying, if the country you're trading with has high tariffs, you don't need to reciprocate that because they are just, screwing themselves over. So why would you want to follow them there? And then other longer term, recommendations, and these would include, the repealing of things like ITAC, as you mentioned, and replacing it with a much more independent body, and pretty much leveraging, things like South Africa's inclusion in the Africa Free Trade Agreement, and which would be much more easier to do that if we lower general, tariffs and general trade, streamlining customs, as we can all see on the screen. But most importantly for me, it is like these vestiges of apartheid capital controls, right? Like the selective disdain that is shown by our politicians to certain legislative controls that were instituted by the National Party. They will say you're trying to protect the legacy of apartheid, but then they still have things like capital controls, which do influence, our ability to attract foreign direct investment, because if you can't take your money out easily of a place, you won't even begin to put it in there, right? And that, to me, is a no-brainer. I don't know why we still have capital controls when they were so clearly instituted by the NP government to try and stunt, any form of opposition or any money leaving the South African state, because they wanted to prop up their artificial economy, right? So I don't get it, to me. So that is a very important recommendation. Of course, legislative ones, which are always great, but much more longer term, right? So I don't know whether we'll always, whether we'll even get to this point. I know the Constitution does have the freedom to trade, right? The right to trade in the Bill of Rights, but the way our courts understand this is not the correct manner to understand the right to trade. So I love the legislative intervention. To me, beyond the immediate one, I think that one is something that's, as the FMF, we should always strive to work towards, trying to enshrine an actual, legislative principles that gives people the right to trade, the right to, pretty much freely enterprise. So yeah, that was Monet's paper. I'm sure if he was here, he would be in a much more better, situation to explain it. To me, I'm just responding as someone who was listening to it and, learning as much as I could from somebody. Yeah, man, the slide. Yeah, the point was great. Every time I see the points, I'm like, so yeah, that was pretty cool. But yeah, that was a paper. And if anyone hasn't read it, who's watching, please go do and read it. Tariffs and imports are pretty important. Then you'll get to see how, even though our politicians are stupid, do not get that wrong, but every politician is stupid. Donald Trump too is stupid with his institution of tariffs. So yeah, please go and check that out.
Yeah, David, I see you have the paper on the screen there. Any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, I just share Zakes's mind-blowing moment around this trilemma that Monet constructed, which I think really beautifully illustrates the Thomas Sowell quote that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And yeah, and I think the point that Monet was making is, I think political leaders, policymakers are trying to do all three things at once. They're trying to protect local industries. If you consider Donald Trump wanting to resuscitate the Rust Belt states, but they also want to generate revenue for state coffers and also flex their geopolitical muscles on the global stage. But you actually, when you do one of these things, it's kind of like whack-a-mole. You hit one mole and then another one pops up over there. You can see how familiar I am with the game whack-a-mole. But I think the point here is, look, if you want to protect local industries, you got to have high, stable tariffs. But that means you're going to have lower amounts of imports. You're going to lack flexibility, and you're also going to reduce revenue from imports because there's going to be fewer goods coming in. I mean, bear in mind that governments also generate revenue from sales taxes, right? So when you buy the Samsung flat screen TV, the government is generating revenue from that at the point of sale. So, when you hammer imports, you're also potentially going to be losing tax revenue. And if you wanted to generate revenue, you actually got to keep tariffs pretty low and facilitate and encourage imports. Again, then you're lacking flexibility. And so the power dynamic, the geopolitical interests, you actually want to be super flexible so that you can undermine your opponents and keep them guessing. But then again, you're losing revenue, and also you're not really creating that long-term view for local producers. And I just think there's a fundamental misapprehension at play, which is that trade is some kind of zero-sum game, that the buyer is losing and the producer is winning. But I often use the example of the double thank yous, which I think Johan Norberg referenced in his Capitalist Manifesto, the latest, his second latest book. And, if you go to the store to buy a sandwich, and when you're at the checkout counter, you both say thank you. Like, you as the consumer, you're saying thank you for the provision of the sandwich, and the retailer is saying, well, thank you for shopping with us. You're both benefiting. There's a reason why you both say thank you. I was a very keen watcher of Mike Sham's program, The State of the Nation, which is doing really well on YouTube, I see. And he made the argument, if you want to undermine Chinese industry, then you should buy a Chinese car, because the People's Republic of China is subsidizing the value of those cars. So if you want to hit your opponents in China, then you should definitely buy a Chinese vehicle. I think one of the reasons I try and avoid Chinese electronics is because it's probably riddled with espionage technology, and I don't want my car spying on my conversations. Look, it'll probably be good if the commissars at the People's Republic of China in the kind of high organs of the state could hear some of our discussions, because they would be exposed to the enduring principles of liberty. But the trite saying that we hear so often, nobody wins a trade war, I think is actually true. I think you got to understand that we live in a globally interconnected world, and retreating behind your protectionist borders is actually going to undermine your own interests, your own competitiveness. And I think COVID was a very interesting example of just how interdependent we are. And when there were disruptions in supply chains, that was very disruptive. And so, you could make an argument to say there is some legitimate strategic interest that a manufacturer might have in onshoring some of their manufacturing capabilities. If you think of just-in-time manufacturing, a clothing retailer like Zara, actually, they have very high turnover of brands and items that they sell. And so they're headquartered in Spain, I think, and they actually have an interest in onshoring some of their clothing and garment manufacturing, so that they can respond to seasonal changes or changes in trends or preferences in the consumer market. So, and I think a lot of people in South Africa probably benefit from gaining access to cheap Chinese imports. But there's also, higher end consumers who might scorn those things and say, well, they want some locally made leather shoes, for example, that are a signal of their preferences. So, I think markets are very complicated, and there's this fallacy of human action that some political actor will have perfect insight into exactly what the domestic economy needs, and if you just pull a few levers, then you can perfectly control the outcomes. And I think that that's a very flawed assumption, and I think you just got to let markets be free and embrace the laissez-faire attitude that Zakes was referring to.
No, absolutely. Ayanda, any thoughts from your side? I know you were watching the launch of Dr. Malan's paper, and you're also engaging in some of the discussions. So give us some of your insights.
No, thank you, Martin. I think David and Zakes have done a very good job of sort of explaining the internal contradictions, in the logic and the arguments that are being made by people who are against free trade. So Zakes has correctly pointed out that if you want to protect domestic industries, for example, then you don't want a case where there are too many imports coming in because that threatens your own industries. On the other hand, if you're looking for revenue, you do want imports because you do want to make money. So I don't think I want to go into that. As I've said, David and Zex have really done a good job of explaining that. What I want to go into is a point that I made the other day, and I want to zoom into this argument of protecting domestic industries or local industries, because the important thing to understand about the debate around trade is that it is informed by domestic policy as well. It is also informed by debates that we are having domestically. So the idea is, if we want to protect our own domestic industries, then we need to ensure that we shield them from foreign competition. Because the whole idea is, if we shield them from foreign competition, they can grow and become competitive. But as I suggested the other day, I don't think that that is the formula. That is not the way to go about it. If you would think that protectionism is the way in which you're going to make your own industries competitive, then you're heading for a loss. Because as David has already said, that at the end of the day actually affects people in the country, your own people who now have to deal with higher prices because of this tax that you have imposed on tariffs. The better alternative, what you want to do if you want to make your manufacturing sector competitive, for example, is to look at the kinds of domestic policies we have in place, the labor laws and the regulatory framework that we have in place in the country, and how you can reform that. And once you do that, once you reform it, once you make it easy for businesses in the country to create jobs without all the hurdles that they have to go through, you will find that in time your own industries are going to become competitive and they can compete with other countries like China, and other countries in Southeast Asia as well. But if you think protectionism is what is going to make your industries competitive, then you are wrong. What you really need to do is to reform the domestic policy as well, to understand that what makes your industries competitive is removing these hurdles that make it difficult for people to create employment. And I say this because of these arguments that are being raised by the people on the other side who, are sort of saying that this country can industrialize and develop without interrogating the labor laws that we have in place. China today, as we know it, had those discussions internally, and it was decided that the way which we're going to pursue, or the path we're going to pursue for full industrialization, is liberalizing our economy. So this idea that China is somehow a symbol of, uh, um, the success of socialism or the success of state-led growth is simply not true. China, in fact, aggressively liberalized its economy, and that's what enabled it to become the factory of the world. So my point is, if South Africa wants to become the factory of the world, if it wants to make its manufacturing sector competitive, protectionism is not going to do that. What is going to do that is to interrogate your own domestic policies, reform them, and in the long run, or in the medium to long term, that is going to have a positive impact in terms of the country's ability to be competitive when it comes to trade and manufacturing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Okay, for what stands out to me is, and this doesn't just apply in trade. It seems to apply with our government to every area of state involvement, and it's something that that David mentioned earlier about the Thomas Sowell quote. Life is a series of trade-offs, and it just occurs to me that the South African political elite, I don't even just want to say the ANC, because I get the same vibes from the DA, from the EFF, etc., is this idea that we can have our cake and eat it too all of the time on everything forever. This idea that we must have these kind of labor controls to kind of create this idyllic comfort for workers that they don't have to really worry about anything. They don't have to worry about getting fired. They don't have to really worry about performing well at work, but also they must receive a living wage. And also our market must be competitive, and all these things must kind of happen simultaneously, and we all live in this kind of utopia. And it's like, no. If you really think China is this model, kind of, or the Asian tigers, China, South Korea, Japan, kind of is this model of how the state, kind of the developmental state, can industrialize your economy. Yeah, sure, you can do that. Like, we're free marketeers. We think the free market is the best, most moral way to do these things. But there are ways that the state can help, but you're not going to like it. Like, you're going to have to offer something up. In China, there is no question of workers' rights. Like, banish the thought. Like, it's a communist workers' republic, or whatever they want to call themselves. But they will disappear you if you become a problematic worker. If you think you're going to strike because working conditions aren't great and your union is going to strike, no, like, you're going to come second in that plan. So what China did, and what a lot of Asian countries do, is they say labor in this country is basically free. That is why everyone cries about the sweatshops in Bangladesh and all these things about kind of creating our clothes and kind of slave labor somewhere, putting the chips in our phones and so on. Yes, yeah, that is how that government has decided to do state-led development. They said that you're not going to have any workers' rights. We're going to subsidize your industry, and we're going to draw the world's industry here. And that happened. People like cheap labor. Companies like cheap labor, and that's the, you have to choose. You have to choose what you want. And our view is that that's a losing game. You're gonna sacrifice human kind of dignity for liberty. You're gonna sacrifice growth for comfort, and that is why we are free marketeers, because the market actually it does the balancing act for you. It doesn't like leave it up to the Politburo of the Communist Party or the NEC of the ANC. But when you try to kind of have a top-down state-led development, then you're gonna have to, as a state, be willing to make sacrifices, which the South African government is not willing to do. It says we want everything to be ideal all of the time, and we want to lead it. And it just shows how that's simply not possible. This attempt by the political elite necessarily is going to fail because they're learning all the wrong lessons from their exemplars in the world, like China. Zakes, I think a while back you actually had quite a bit to say about how China has developed and how it has approached labor law. I think that would be an interesting thing, because it does link up with this idea of we have to do something about domestic policy before we can kind of leapfrog.
Yeah, and I mean it's a great point from Ayanda, right? Because it is like the two are intimately tied. A lot of people think that trade or the ability to attract investment, at least in South Africa currently, is contingent on us taking this ICJ case or having good buddy relationships with the US. But really, the most important thing is our domestic state able to generate enough growth for any capital across the world to be attracted enough. Like for someone who has a pension in the US, would be like, hey, my pension will grow bigger if I take this money to South Africa instead of here in America. That is the whole point. And in China, as you said, Martin, the ability to understand trade-offs was like they got it. They got it. Deng Xiaoping, I'm a huge studier, for lack of a better term, of the entire Chinese domestic policy, especially, and the dynamics within it, right? And how very similar, like a lot of Chinese governments, like beyond the competence, because they have a culture for centuries of competent administration, but the motivations and the self-interest and the patronage is like all the same. So to me, it is always fascinating. But with China, they decided to just get rid of labor protections. Right? Trade unionism in China is not a thing. Trade unions exist, but they are extensions. There's one, like pretty much their version of COSATU is an extension of the Chinese Communist Party. And the logic, of course, of Marxists is that no, the workers control the state. So why you need a union for? Yeah? There were no unions anyway. There were no. Lenin is avowedly has written a lot of words against unionism, even going back to Marx, right? So generally, the idea that if you control the state as the worker, then there's no need for a union. Now go work in that sweatshop and be happy. But yeah, the unfortunate thing, right, with what you mentioned, Martin, that how liberty is always the best solution, right? To me, when people always raise the issue of China, I'm like, look, China has grown. You cannot, in an outcome-based world, you cannot deny the outcomes, right? Even though they cook the numbers most definitely, but like you can see that the Chinese economy has grown. It is a very important part of the global economy. But I always, tell people to like contrast that with like the US economy, right? Which also is pretty big, which has grown and is still growing and is still extremely attractive to a whole lot of people. And it took an entirely different model than the Chinese one, or at least, since given the nature of democracy, maybe you would say during FDR's time is when you had a bit of Chinese-like development. But even then, right, you still had much more stronger property right, like much more stronger market-oriented economies whereby the state cannot just, FDR could not arrest a CEO of Ford, for instance, just because, the CEO of Ford said, hey, don't, don't do that. Or maybe you can do governance better. Like he could have tried, but he can't do that. In China, you do that. In China, they disappear you if you're the richest man in the land, and they will re-educate you and you will come out saying, hey, the Chinese economy is great. But the point I'm making is that the Chinese economy has still not grown past the US economy, even though the Chinese economy, one would say, even though it has liberalized, right, much more liberal than during Mao's time, it is still not as liberal as the US economy, which is also not, the most liberal in the world. But, the US economy is still quite bigger than the Chinese one, and it got there using a different route than the Chinese one. So I think that to me is very important, and especially looking at the modern China, like Chinese economic problems are state created, and they become very difficult for the state to solve because the state is so intimately involved in how that economy is structured, right? From the subsidization of industries in things like property development. That's why you have ghost towns in China, whereby they subsidize the development of entire cities without any market demand. And I'm saying, how do you solve that though? Because now you have an entire industry that is contingent, a property development industry that is contingent on subsidization from the state. You have people who invest in these industries, but there is no real market of it outside of the government saying, hey, people must work, there must be cranes all across China and things must be built. And now after those things are built, they just stand there for years, not being occupied by anyone. I'm like, is that the growth we want, right? Of course, the people who are employed in the building of that, raw materials were bought in Africa. We love the Chinese. They're always building stuff, so they're always buying raw materials. But I'm like, like for us in terms of industrialization, do we want to have a bunch of ghost cities littered across the African continent and feeling good just because we had people build that stuff? So liberty for me is always the most preferable solution, right? When you look at even in countries that are interventionists like China, they grew despite the intervention, not because of it. And a lot of people tend to think that, or even in South Korea, whereby you have like all of these state-owned entities or these state subsidized entities, state protected entities are like, oh no, but like, they grew. They are great. I'm like, they are growing despite that, not because of it. And I think once we get to understand it, it would help us a great deal. And with China, it's much more easier, right? Because you had the most interventionist economy under Mao's time, and it did not grow as large as the more liberal economy. So you cannot then say that intervention is what caused the growth. No, intervention was always there, and it killed millions of people. In the Black Book, if anyone has read it, I'm sure people who watch us have definitely read it or know of it. And then when Deng Xiaoping came in, shut up, Dave. When Deng Xiaoping came in, then he liberalized the economy, and that's what made it grow, which shows the case for liberty, something that we should always keep in mind. And of course, on the point of domestic policy, I think for me it is very important for countries like dictatorships, right? They don't have any internal democratic processes in China, so they can just institute. If Xi Jinping decides, hey, this is what we're doing now, that is what the Chinese people will be doing then, whereas in other countries, it is very difficult, at least the domestic policy aspect of it. But we definitely need to take heed of that. To your point, Martin, we need to understand that we cannot eat our cake and still have it. It is impossible. I've written an article about how, like public sector unions are killing the golden goose by always arguing for higher salaries, and as such this necessitates higher taxes, and that leads to a reduction in growth, which ultimately will lead to them losing their employment prospects, right? I wrote this about 2 years ago, and 2 years later we had a budgetary crisis, but no one seems to be taking it seriously. I guess they will take it seriously when it's time for retrenchments within the state, and only then will people start caring about unemployment and everything like that. And it's not like we have millions of unemployed people right now, but the willingness to make trade-offs, to me, is unfortunate. But I don't think that there's any trade-off to be made really when people are free. Then you allow individuals to make those trade-offs, rather than like this idea like, no, as the father of the nation you get to decide the economy of the, like, no, don't do that. Don't do that. You will fail. Rather, just let people be free and best believe that they will take decisions that best benefit them. So yeah, like I can talk about China the whole day. I'm sorry for rambling on. So yeah, anyone if has any thoughts.
Oh, thanks a lot. David, any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, so something that's interesting about Deng Xiaoping is I always thought that he just kind of had this epiphany and thought, well, now that Mao is dead, let's just try something new. And it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, is the famous phrase attributed to him. But the cataclysmic results of the Great Leap Forward, which was essentially a state-led industrialization program, which was designed to kind of leapfrog China into a different stage of industrial development, that resulted in widespread famine. So the Cultural Revolution of the 60s, was more of a political repression, shutting down opponents of the party and expunging rivals within the party. But the Great Leap Forward was absolutely devastating for particularly the peasantry in China. And if you read some of the books, like Frank Dakota has written a really interesting book about I think he wrote a book about the Cultural Revolution and one about the Great Leap Forward. And I mean, one of the mistakes that they made is they instituted a policy that you had to have this like very deep furrow agricultural planting. I'm not exactly an agricultural expert, but basically what it meant is that the peasants were incentivized to dig even further deeper into the land to ridiculous lengths, like 6 feet below the surface of the land. And the central bureaucracy didn't really understand these centuries-long farming techniques that had been built up, and the kind of latent knowledge that a lot of these farmers had. And they would also collectivize agriculture and then redistribute it. And so there was a lot of theft of the agricultural products. There was a lot of misreporting. So people would put sand in the grain stocks or the rice stocks to artificially boost the weight of the cargo. And what resulted was widespread famine. I mean, literally millions of people died of starvation, and people were, boiling their leather shoes to make broth out of that, or they were boiling bark off of trees, and the entire bird population basically got wiped out because people were throwing stones at birds to try and find something to eat. And what Deng Xiaoping did in the wake of this absolute horrific circumstance was he just basically allowed peasant farmers to start cultivating their crops in their traditional way. But he was responding to this bottom-up pressure from these farmers who were basically acting out of pure necessity, because otherwise they were just going to starve. And so politically, he was quite deft in basically just embracing this and saying, okay, well, we will let you. But actually, if you didn't do that, there would have been a complete uprising against the Communist Party. So I think that's kind of interesting. Zex, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah. Every time you talk about China, I'm always interested because like China is a very interesting place. But Deng Xiaoping actually was arrested during Mao's time, right? As you say, he was responding to upward like pressure from the peasants who wanted better lives. And Deng Xiaoping is one of the prominent figures within the Communist Party. Actually, like the Cultural Revolution was a response to people like Deng Xiaoping who started writing within the Communist Party about reforms, about something that may even resemble something like that. Not the entirety, of course, of the Cultural Revolution, but when there's the Gang of Six, group of Chinese officials that were arrested by the CCP right before Mao's death. When Mao was dying, actually, when Mao died, Deng Xiaoping was under house arrest because Mao considered him an enemy of the party due to him advocating for those reforms. So yeah, he was actually beyond him saying, they need to do this or else they will, be child, which was really a reality for them, especially as higher echelon members. But he also genuinely wanted to see reforms, right? He was writing within the Chinese Communist Party, which made him attract a lot of attention from Mao. And then he ended up getting, put under house arrest. So actually, I guess you would say Mao's death really made it possible because I'm sure he was slated to be killed ever since he was under house arrest. But when Mao died, then the party's dynamics, since there was a power vacuum, sort of changed, and the reformers who already existed within the party, right, when then got an opportunity to like cement themselves. So yeah, it is not entirely related to trade or anything. I just thought it is a nice piece of Chinese communist history.
Yeah, but if you go further back in Chinese history, I mean, I mentioned Johann Norberg. I'm reading his latest book called Peak Human, and it's about the rise and fall of various civilizations. So he looks at ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East. But yeah, he also looks at the Song Dynasty, and one of the features of the Song Dynasty was this, big outward facing, trading, embracing trade with the rest of the world, maritime power in the region as well, and just unleashed an incredible amount of prosperity and human flourishing. And compared to Europe at the same time, I think this is kind of in the 11th and 12th century. I mean, Europe was pretty backward at the time. It was, the kind of medieval period. And so, China was really like the center of wealth and civilization globally. But, eventually that dynasty came to an end and was replaced by the Jin dynasty. And that was the complete opposite, was kind of closing the barricades, locking out the rest of the world. And, they even deliberately shut down a lot of their naval fleet, right? And this enabled over centuries for the Europeans to adopt this kind of technology. So if you think of, the production of paper, gunpowder, some of these like leading technologies that were developed under the Song dynasty. But they basically just stifled all innovation after that under the Jin. And, that enabled other global powers to catch up. So, there's this myth that, okay, if you kind of close yourself off from the rest of the world, you can actually strengthen yourself, and now you're not benefiting your opponents. But actually the opposite applies, is you become calcified and weak and stale. And fast forward to the 19th century, the Chinese were completely vulnerable to external colonial imposition, and that was, I don't know, what do they call it, Zex? The great century of shame, or the century of humiliation, I think is what they call.
Yeah.
So
The century of
if you
humiliation.
so if you want to be strong, you got to embrace globalization, free trade, liberalization, and that's also how you become permeable to other ideas. That's how you get access to innovative new technologies and ways of doing things. So I think if you want to be powerful and mighty and admired, you got to open up those doors.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like I always say, there is no example of a poor free market anywhere in the world. Like, it doesn't exist. There are examples of rich interventionist states, but the rule seems to always be that the closer you move to freedom, the more prosperity just necessarily results, and the further away you move, the more you have to start kind of politically trying to balance competing interests, and kind of it becomes very precarious. And as far as kind of this fallacy of deficits, kind of import export deficits go, it's like you look at countries like Greenland, and you look at countries like Monaco, and you look at countries like Switzerland, and you look at countries like Hong Kong and Macau, and so on, that have virtually no natural resources of their own. They import almost everything that they need, and yet these are prosperous places. Liechtenstein, that I had the privilege of visiting, I mean, sure, they have like 2 farms there. They have the Hilti factory there. It's their kind of prized possession. But I mean, everything else that they need, they import. And I don't see, when I was there at least, I didn't see people in the streets kind of bawling their eyes out about how terrible it is that they have this massive import-export deficit. Oh God, we need a competitive local industry. We need to protect our farmers from these Germans and Austrians. No, I mean, just stop. Just stop it. Like, it's not necessary. South Africa is competitive in many things, actually. We can have a very vibrant mining, very vibrant agricultural industry. We don't have to have people making cars here. It'd be nice, but let's let the market decide if that's something that we should be doing. And if we end up having to import everything, cheap Brazilian chicken or whatever, I mean, cool, fine. That's okay. We'll be better off for it. Make us a tax haven. We manufacture nothing. Companies flood here to come and incorporate here and have access to the African market. We'll be a rich society in short order. But no, it's because of how counterintuitive what I've just said is, that politicians can kind of say, no, but if we send out our apples to be kind of reworked in the Philippines, and then like that's a problem. It's like, no, it's markets, economies, price efficiency. Yeah, Ayanda, any thoughts from you on this?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm going to have time to ask a question, but I do want to
Please do.
add to your I do want to add to your point and say that what David said earlier on, the trade is not a zero-sum game. In fact, our domestic industries are going to benefit from being able to access cheap imports. I mean, there are people in this country who manufacture clothing, they sell branded clothing. And one of the complaints that they often raise is that, these imports at times can be very, very expensive, and that makes it difficult for them in terms of their operational costs and everything. So one of the important points that Dr. Malan made the other day in his presentation is that liberalizing the economy gives domestic industries easier access to cheaper imports, and that also benefits our domestic industries, as opposed to, imposing these high tariffs that at the end of the day are also going to harm domestic industries. But one of the claims that I've heard often, and I heard this claim again from someone who I think is a libertarian, it was quite outrageous for me. Him saying that China is somehow cheating the international trade system. He never explained why. Of course, he said that, but I perhaps wanted to ask this to Zakes. Where does this claim come from that China is somehow cheating the trade system? I've heard Donald Trump many times say it. But I've never really heard anyone explain how China is cheating the system. So any thoughts on your end, Zakes, maybe, and where that comes from?
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Get to talk about China even more now. So cool. Yeah, but no, it comes, I would say, from 2 places, right? Well, first from IP, right? China, there's this thing called TRIPS, I think an international treaty for like intellectual property. And even though China is signatory to it, China, when you invest in it, the government is not as strict in enforcing your intellectual property rights should another Chinese factory, for instance, start producing exactly what you're producing, just under a different name, right? So they say that they cheat. Like the IP part is that they don't offer protection for IP in domestic China, thus making investment in domestic China a loss pretty much. You get the returns that you do, but you lose brand integrity. This is actually what a lot of people say, that this is what started the Chinese electric car industry, right? Tesla was allowed to operate in China, and as part of the contingency there, they had to kind of really give up their IP because there was nothing that they could do to protect it, because the Chinese government was not willing to protect it. And as such, China now has BYD and has pretty much overtaken Tesla as the leading, electric manufacturer. So that's one aspect. So they're like, the Chinese are bad for doing that, because American systems or American institutions are much more stronger. Chinese companies can, like, for instance, what TikTok can, go to China, to American courts, should another company try and take an aspect of the algorithm or IP, right? They can get recourse. Whereas in China, given the nature of the justice system there, the chances of you getting recourse are extremely slim. Not that you can't, right? They have to have a pretense of keeping up with this IP thing, but it becomes very difficult. So that's one aspect. And then there's a tariff aspect, which really comes from a misunderstanding of economics from particularly, politicians. It is unfortunate that you have had whatever libertarian who say that China is also cheating in I don't know what aspect they meant it, but in trade, China has higher tariffs on imports that are coming into China, whereas it is part of the WTO, and China always tries to negotiate for lower tariffs for the products that they do export to other countries. But to me, that does not seem like something that is hurting other countries, because that is usually the basic argument. China charges higher tariffs than we do on their goods. That is what they mean when they say the Chinese are cheating. The Chinese charge higher tariffs and the Chinese subsidize their industries. The Chinese, like the normal, things that we spoke about when we spoke about the protection of like industries, or the normal motivations for people who are arguing for protectionism. So they're saying the Chinese subsidize their industries, and then they put high imports. They make their markets inaccessible. That is true. The Chinese domestic market is very hard to access compared to other markets. So they make their markets inaccessible, which means that they get to protect their industries whilst the rest of the world opens up, because they believe in free market liberalization. And then they get flooded by these cheap Chinese goods, which make things cheaper for their citizens and kills their manufacturing capacity in that country, because you want to make things that are expensive instead of getting those same things for cheaper. But yeah, that is the general logic, that Chinese imports that are subsidized, if you allow them into your country, will kill your industry. In South Africa, we saw this too, right? In the textile industry, they're saying that the South African textile manufacturers cannot, export their clothes to China, whereas China is constantly exporting clothes to South Africa, right? But I think, as Dr. Malan said in his presentation, countries don't engage in trade. There's like, South Africa does not take everyone's suggest the things that they want and go to China and be like, yeah, here's the money, give us the things and we'll give it to the people. Individuals engage in trade. So it becomes like South Africans want to buy cheap Chinese products or Americans or something like that. But yeah, in general, that is what they mean when they say that the Chinese are cheating the international trade system. One, on the IP side, and two, on like, it usually comes from people who do not believe, like people who are opposed to things like NAFTA and every other trade deal that pretty much liberalized, the movement of goods in between two or more jurisdictions. People who are opposed to that will be like, China is growing because we are buying Chinese goods and they aren't buying any of our goods. So yeah, to answer your question.
Cool. Yeah, so we've hit an hour, guys. I'm gonna wrap it up there and give everyone a last word. So last in, first out. Ayanda, let's start with you.
Well, I think my last word is I love Chinese products. I mean, most of my clothes come from China, I can show you. So I would not want the prices of those goods to go up. I want them to remain cheap. And I think tariffs are going to come in the way of that. So my last word is politicians, please stay out of trade. Please allow us to trade with other people across the world so we can benefit as consumers from low prices. Tariffs, at the end of the day, don't harm you, they harm us, because businesses pass on the costs to us as consumers. So really, at the end of the day, when we have these discussions about policies, trade policies, we need to understand that these are policies which have an impact on people's lives, really. And if you're not going to consider that, you're going to harm us. At the end of the day, I want to keep buying from China. I have no issue with buying Chinese products. I think that would be my last word.
Zakes?
Yeah. Last word. I think I've been monopolizing the pod, so I'll try to keep this brief. Trade is good. Like we cannot overstate this. Part of the main reasons why I became a libertarian for me, as David, pointed out, is that I saw the relative lack of power that Africa in general and South Africa had. And this one, like, how do you get powerful in this whole global game, right? And this drew me to economics and made the case, which was pretty sound to me, that allowing people to be free, especially your people, right? Allowing that to happen, and just generally believing them, like, believe that people will act in their best interest, and even if they don't, it's better that they are screwing themselves instead of more people than one, right? So yeah, man, let us, beyond the consequences to me, because we've been speaking about the benefits of trade, and the benefits are great from a principle level, from a just like, let people be free. If I want to buy something from the US, from Kazakhstan, from anywhere across the world, I should have the ability to do that. It is a good thing that I'm able to do that. And as such, yeah, the consequences are just the added cherry on top, right? Just the basic principle of allowing people to be free in every sense of the word, including not being defined by their ability, not being handed by jurisdictional lines. That to me is pretty important. It's a pretty cool, it's a pretty noble thing to aspire to. So yeah, maybe we should try and make that cool, make freedom cool again, since we are living in a world that seems to think that being a liberal is a sin or something that you should be ashamed of. But believing in freedom is always a good thing. So in this instance with trade, let us believe in freedom, because as Makeba said, we want cheap stuff, right? We want South Africa to be able to make cheap stuff, and we want to buy cheap stuff from anywhere else. But this also will necessitate a conversation about kind of value of currency and everything like that. So a topic for another day. But yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, well said, David.
Yeah, I agree with Zakes. And I think something that critics of free trade often bring up, and I think we should not dismiss it glibly, is the social cost of some of this disruption that you're going to get, say, the clothing and textiles industry in the Western Cape, which was very much interwoven, forgive the metaphor, with the community in the Western Cape. And that when you have a lot of competition coming along and wiping out that industry, that has a social effect, that disrupts those communities. But my response to that would be, well, somebody is always going to bear the cost of an intervention. So are you going to demand that taxpayers come in and protect that industry? And that is going to put an extra burden on the fiscus. Are you going to demand that consumers bear that cost by imposing a tariff? Let people decide, let them choose what they want. But also think there's a very unfortunate mentality that underlies that thinking, which is that basically wealth and productive capability is like this static thing that you just need to protect, and basically you just want to maintain the status quo. And there's something very unambitious about that. It kind of assumes that what we have is all we're capable of. But I mean, if you look at some of the societies around the world that have endured a nuclear holocaust, like Japan, I mean, you can't get any worse than a nuclear bomb being dropped on your city. I mean, that is the most devastating thing ever. The fact that they were able to develop their industry and become competitive through export-driven growth, by the way. Some people might say, oh, well, they had a lot of state intervention, but ultimately they embraced globalization. The countries that were under the jackboot of Soviet communism in Eastern Europe, that in a very short period of time, similar time frame to what we're dealing with here in terms of the 1990s to today, they were able to fundamentally transform their economies. A country like Poland is now almost as wealthy as the United Kingdom, which was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. So don't underestimate the pace and the intensity of economic change. And growth necessarily is disruptive, as Schumpeter told us. There's creative destruction. The fax machine industry was destroyed by email, but we don't lament and pine for the fax machine to come back. It is technology that is now redundant, and we now use better technology. So, I think part of it is about having a broader view, and also an underlying faith in the ability of people to create new value, to innovate. And yes, economic production and your source of livelihood is very important from an income perspective, but also from a social perspective. But that should be a reminder to us that actually we need to really work hard at creating new industries, at generating wealth. This is intertwined with human prosperity, and growth is what we need to transform the situation of the many millions of poor people in South Africa. So, and we can only do that by embracing free trade, becoming competitive, lowering our taxes, reducing the size of government. Those are the key ingredients for prosperity.
Yeah, very well said. I would like to add to that. I mean, it puts people like us in a very difficult position, having this kind of empathy that we should have, and which everyone should have, but without the kind of reciprocal recognition that the debate is taking place at a very kind of advanced level, and that too many things are being assumed. So what I kind of mean by that is that the people who will say that we need to protect our textile industry, have to protect our motor vehicle industry and euthanasia, we have to protect this and that or the other, otherwise all these families will lose their jobs, is because all of them grew up, like I did, in a society where the economy has always been going backwards. So kind of when I was a toddler and so on, there was economic growth. I have no memory of that. Like I'm 31 this year. I'm not a terribly old man, but my whole conscious life has been one of only knowing economic decline in this country. Now it's taken me kind of having to go kind of abroad and having to see that in fact practice is downstream from policy, and policy is in fact downstream from ideology. You see that what we have in South Africa is not predetermined. Kind of 14 million unemployed is not kind of part of the furniture of the African landscape. It's not built in. It's not a default state. This is something that is artificially kept in place. And for people to then say, oh, but if you liberalize trade, then all these people will lose their jobs and they'll be unemployed. The answer is yes. Unfortunately, that is the case. But we want them to just go and find other work. I had a conversation with one of our friends, Beki Mahlobo, a few weeks ago. He's currently abroad, and he said one of the things that really stuck with him, kind of living in this Western society, is that you could walk down the street and see a "We're hiring" sign in the window of a business, and you'll look across the street and you'll see another "We're hiring" sign in the window of that business, and it's like most South Africans. And we won't kind of understand this, but most South Africans have no concept of that. Like this notion that you could lose a job and then be employed again the next morning at a different place. Like this is normal. This is a normal thing, but it's so unknown to us, and therefore we have to kind of surmount this additional hill. When we say free trade, we need cheaper goods. And yes, that will disrupt your lives. But if we have a wholesale agenda of liberalization, in fact, you will find a different job. And now you'll be able to buy the fabrics that you were making yesterday for cheaper. You will now benefit from losing your own job and having a different job and kind of climbing the ladder to prosperity. The social mobility that a free market fundamentally allows. And it's that point about the wholesale liberalization that's important in this context. And that is what our Liberty First project at the Free Market Foundation is all about. We're not just saying, oh, kind of close your eyes and just free trade, and then kind of it'll be Eden will return to Earth. No, this is a comprehensive agenda. Freedom is a kind of a package deal in many cases. We will take a little bit of freedom rather than no freedom, but if you really want to enjoy the benefits of freedom, you really have to go full hog on it and free the market as regards labor, as regards trade, as regards regulation, health and safety. Even I know that's people's kind of touchy point. Yes, even health and safety regulations have to be relaxed, etc., etc., etc. And when you do that, the disruptions that David refers to are going to be far more bearable. If you remove the BEE domestic tariff that we have imposed on our own economy, then external tariffs imposed on the economy that we don't have direct control over are far more bearable to the local economy. That is just how it works. And so we would encourage listeners who maybe feel a little bit unsure and think we're being a little bit too one-dimensional on trade. No, go and look at our Liberty First proposals. That's libertyfirst.co.za, and see our comprehensive reform agenda. And you'll be seeing a lot more from us in Liberty First. The next papers that will be launched will be by David. It will be on kind of sound money and kind of the opportunities offered by alternative currencies. Dr. Malan will be back. He will tell us about the benefits of slashing the size of government, slashing cabinet size, kind of eliminating some of the excess fat that we have that taxpayers are paying for. That's also kind of sponging up a lot of economic dynamism. And Jakes will be talking about employment, very important, kind of getting people working. And that's going to be very exciting, because the FMF, the Free Market Foundation, I think has been leading with innovative thoughts on how to solve unemployment. It's not rocket science. It's not something that you have to spend decades doing. It's something that you can just do. So please keep an eye on that. But that's it for the Rational Standard for this week, and we want to thank all of you for joining us live, and everyone else who's going to watch this a little bit later. Rationalstandard.com and .co.za. I've been kind of getting the link wrong a few times, but now there is a redirect, so feel free to visit either of those links, and please restack and like this content there. Make sure it gets spread around Substack. Please like this video on YouTube and share it on social media. Please subscribe to the Rational Standard channel on YouTube and click the bell icon to make sure you get notified of our weekly episodes consistently every Friday at noon.
Before we go, Martin.
Yeah, please.
Can I ask the gentlemen in their 20s here if they know what a fax machine is? Please describe, what is a fax machine, Zakes?
I think you put a paper in it, and the paper comes out to another machine that you sent the paper to. I don't know. I always look at it like what is it? A typewriter, right? It seems this very weird, obscure thing that I think I know how it works. But if we were to say, hey, send a fax to this person, I would have no idea how to do that.
Wait until someone has to explain what a telegram is. I don't even know how that works. I have Telegram on my phone, but I have a feeling that it's a different Telegram.
It's a different. I was about to say that. Yeah. No, I doubt Ayanda even has ever seen one, right? Since he's the youngest here, I doubt he even knows what it is, this fax machine thing. He hears us talk
Ayanda
about
is still.
No, I actually do.
Recently, I think university still use that kind of tech.
Oh yeah. Oh my.
I actually do.
Yeah.
I actually do.
No.
But I think we're out of time.
Do you use an email to fax service, or because that was one of those transition technologies where you can send an email to a fax machine?
Actually do.
But can you send a fax to an email though? That's the question.
Right.
No, maybe that is yeah. But you can see the velocity of technological change in just 1.5 generations is pretty amazing.
Yeah,
absolutely. No, and I think we're all excited about it, and I think there's reason to be excited about it. There's reason to not be afraid of it, but we need to get the politics out of it. We need to get the politics out of it, and then we can all kind of bask in technological advancement without being overly concerned. Gentlemen, thank you very much for another great episode. We will see you next week, and we will catch you, the audience, again as well next week. Have a good one. Cheerio.